Welcome to History's Influence. For 681 years, the Romans and Persians would intermittently fight along a shared border. This was one of the longest lasting conflicts in human history, with neither side conquering the other. The Romans and Parthians, followed by the Byzantines and Sassanids, would develop familiarity through this warfare, but also through diplomacy and trade. But why did this peculiar dynamic sustain itself for such a long period of time? Why didn't one conquer the other? To find an explanation, let's explore the key periods of the Roman-Persian relationship, whilst teasing out reasons why Rome could never conquer Persia or vice versa. Rome started as a small city-state, under the dominance of the ancient Etruscans, later asserting independence as a republic. Rome would gradually conquer the Italian peninsula, later transforming into a Mediterranean superpower. Their republican form of governance was held dear, but had become unstable under the crushing weight of their expanding empire. Strong men wielded considerable influence by the time the Romans encountered the Parthians. The Parni tribe, related to the Scythians, had overrun the satrapy of Parthia from its Greek ruler. They adopted both Greek and Persian customs, abandoning much of their nomadic origins. They were subject to and would later overthrow the Seleucid Empire, creating their own Parthian Empire, a quasi-Persian empire of sorts. When the Romans and Parthians first came into contact, they were relatively established powers. An Armenian empire was forged during this tumultuous period, but the Romans and Parthians worked together to subdivide it, leaving Armenia in their heartland. Despite this cooperation, the Romans would soon strike against Parthia, decided and led by Crassus, the richest man of Rome and a crucial member of the first triumvirate. It was an unprovoked invasion of Mesopotamia, which he used 7 legions to carry out. The famous Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC was a terrible disaster for the Romans, and an unexpected victory for the outnumbered Parthians. Crassus died in the aftermath, and is believed to have been forced to drink molten gold, something the Romans would not forget. The loss also ended the political power of the first triumvirate. Crassus's fellow member Julius Caesar also planned to invade Parthia, but he was busy invading Gaul. 4 years after Carrhae, Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, embroiling the Republic in a civil war. He was later assassinated, being stabbed a handful of times. Only 23 times or so. The Parthians supported figures such as Brutus, Caesar's friend-turned-stabber, during the conflict. The Parthians also tried to invade Rome themselves, although they were unsuccessful in doing so. Likewise, the second triumvirate member Mark Antony later attempted an invasion of Parthia with 100,000 men. They reached Persia, but had their supply lines cut off. They were harassed and faced heavy casualties. Additionally, their Armenian allies seemingly betrayed them by leaving for home. Perhaps the Armenians forgot to bring their tracksuits. We can see that both powers were capable of initiating warfare, evident from their first few bouts. This was not Rome's game to win, even if they held a mild upper hand in later conflicts. Parthia was more decentralized than its predecessors or successors in Persia. They would have local vassal kings rule regions, as opposed to the centrally chosen satraps, as per the Achaemenid Persians or Seleucid Greeks. Although Parthia's decentralization had its benefits. For example, Parthian civil wars were usually an aristocratic affair, without many civilians affected, keeping the empire safer from external conquest due to any devastation they would cause. But back to Roman Parthia, these initial conflicts would simmer down by the end of the Roman Republic, due to the reign of the first Roman Emperor, Augustus. A steady relationship with Parthia, based upon careful diplomacy, would develop during his reign. including minutiae such as diplomats asking how the Parthians' companions have been during their visits. The propaganda still held themes of total domination, through the Romans wishing to replicate the conquests of Alexander the Great, or the Parthians wishing to restore the borders of the Achaemenid Persians. Augustus had claimed to avenge the loss of the Battle of Carrhae, but this was achieved by having the Parthians return the Roman standards they had stolen. This put an end to the initial conflict they held in a peaceable manner. This is not to say warfare between the two powers did not resume, as Rome continued its attempts to conquer Persia. The great emperor Trajan had invaded the Parthians as his final campaign. A disagreement regarding the shared leadership over Armenia was used as a pretext for a large-scale invasion of Parthia, but the true motives Trajan held, or the internal Roman political context, is unclear. We don't have many sources for the period. Maybe he was feeling a little bit cheeky. Trajan was able to conquer Mesopotamia, annexing most of it as a Roman province, on top of installing a puppet Parthian king in their capital of Ctesiphon. Earlier Roman incursions into regions such as Anatolia would often begin with client-based relationships, followed by provincial rule. However, in other regions, client states remained dominant, with Armenia being a key example. Perhaps Trajan did intend for further conquests, or perhaps he saw the regions past Mesopotamia as too difficult for direct control. In any case, he soon died after conquering Mesopotamia, so we'll never know for sure. Regardless, geography was a consistent issue regarding land acquisition in Roman-Persian conflict. Not many routes of invasion existed. Armenia held crucial choke points, for example, meaning invasions became more predictable and easier to defend against from these particular routes. Not to mention, Armenia's loyalties would often switch at different times, meaning its routes were often restricted. Even when the Romans were able to occupy Mesopotamia, the Iranian plateau itself was very mountainous and hard to navigate. Iran also held artificial water supplies which could be cut off during invasions. It was a logistical nightmare to invade. Just ask Mark Antony, who failed to do so. For the reasons we've discussed, it comes as no surprise that Trajan's successor Hadrian would move their border back to the more defensible Euphrates River. But Mesopotamia was still exposed to temporary occupation. So, why did Parthia keep their capital as Ctesiphon, right in the center of the region? Wouldn't this allow for the Romans to destabilize and later conquer the Parthians? Well, the Parthians would often get their ruling court to flee the city during attacks, and then return when appropriate. Therefore, it wasn't an existential issue to keep their capital in the region. Additionally, Mesopotamia was a fertile and wealthy region, whose control through central cities such as Babylon, Seleucia, and Ctesiphon were beneficial to numerous empires of antiquity. These were beautiful cities. Let me know in the comments any city you wish you could travel back in time to visit. I'd go for Constantinople. Anyway, Ctesiphon was also far away from the Scythian raiders of the north, where their original capital of Nisa was dangerously exposed. The city's location was also suitable for trade access, particularly useful for trade in the Silk Road. This brings us to the wealth, power, and prestige granted to the Parthians by the famous trade route. These Silk Road benefits discouraged aggressive relations with the Romans, so they could both maintain a stable trade flow for them both to benefit from. Interestingly, the rivalry of their merchants created a symbiotic relationship of competitiveness, which actually increased both of their competencies in trade. Anyway, following Hadrian, later Roman invasions, from the emperors Lucius Verus to Maricinus, were more strategic and pragmatic, start and stop ordeals. So why weren't any of these wars or battles decisive, allowing one to conquer the other? Speaking broadly, both empires were usually unable to give their undivided attention to the other. They were large states with numerous troublesome neighbours, although the Parthian army did hold a unique edge initially. They were highly mobile, retaining the horseback riding and archery from their nomadic roots. Parthian attacks, often using a large barrage of arrows, were effective for short battles, although too expensive and ineffective for sustained battles or conquest. The Parthians did eventually improve their siegecraft, however. But we see the Romans and Parthians constantly one-upping the other regarding military advancements, particularly from the 3rd century onwards. There was never a clear breakthrough that led to a landslide win or defeat militarily on either side as a result. At least, not the Romans against the Parthians. In 205 AD, the Persian house of Sassanid had revolted against Parthia, winning a string of victories and inheriting their empire, alongside its 7 aristocratic families. The Romans were unable to capitalize on this period of weakness and transition within Persia. The Emperor Caracalla attempted to replicate Alexander the Great's invasions, but was unpopular and assassinated during his attempt, with the Romans actually paying war reparations to the fractured Parthians afterwards. Anyway, the Sassanids saw themselves as a distinctly Persian empire, labeling their leaders as Shah, King of Kings. This was the same title used by the Achaemenid Persian rulers of old. This was much less laissez-faire than the Greco-Persian rule of the Parthians. The Sassanids had expanded the 7 aristocratic houses to include more families. But generally speaking, they had made the Parthian state into something more centralized, more effective at conquest and power projection. This put the Romans on the back foot of their still relatively even conflicts. The Romans themselves were no longer in their era of peace, the Pax Romana, and had fallen into numerous periods of civil strife, leaving them much weaker than before. As a side note, the Sassanids would often use Roman subsidies to offset expenses, which would ironically reduce conflict in these periods of weakness for the Romans. The Romans later divided into eastern and western halves for administrative convenience in 395 AD. Western Rome fell in 476, whilst the Eastern Roman Empire, which we refer to as the Byzantine Empire, survived. We also see Armenia subdivided between Rome and Persia around the same time, which seemingly contributed to long periods of peace. Closer relations formed with the Byzantines and the Sassanids, with lengthier truces alongside intermarriage between the royal families. Both powers were preoccupied by other external threats in this period. However, tensions would eventually return, particularly from the Anastasius War onwards. The climax was reached in the Byzantine-Sassanian War of 602 to 628 AD. I will personally coin this war the Twilight War, as it's important enough to warrant a quick and memorable name. The Byzantine Emperor Maurice, who helped the Sassanid Shah Khosrow II back onto his throne from a rebellion, ended up being deposed and killed himself. This caused Khosrow II to swear revenge and declare war. The Sassanids were surprised by their initial string of victories, a similar string to how they came to power from the Parthians, and they ended up occupying much of the Byzantine Empire for 20 years. Khosrow II had become ambitious and wished to replicate the Achaemenid conquests of old, but they couldn't complete their siege of the Byzantine capital Constantinople, even with aid from allies. Their conflict had become uncharacteristically brutal, and surprisingly existential for the Byzantines. The old Roman-Persian dynamic was seemingly broken. For example, the Persians had seized the true cross. This was believed to be the cross used to crucify Jesus. This was a huge insult to the Christian Byzantines. This religious element to the war had not existed in previous Roman and Persian conflicts. By this point, both empires had developed strong state religions, with Christianity for the Byzantines and Zoroastrianism for the Sassanids. This was far different from the diverse landscapes of religion within the tolerant Parthian and Roman empires. Going back to the war, the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius was able to mount a counteroffensive. He was winning battle after battle against Persian generals who wished to defeat the final Roman emperor. With the allies of the Gok Turks invading northern Iran, Heraclius reached Mesopotamia, sacking Khosrow's great palace. A peace agreement was soon reached, being status quo antebellum, the same borders as what they held before the war started. The Persians had failed to conquer Roman land past the Euphrates, despite previous peace offerings granting just that. Both empires were incredibly exhausted, and the Sassanids fell into a succession crisis. But only 4 years after the Twilight War had ended, the Islamic conquests had begun, hence my naming of the war. The utterly devastated Roman Persia had to face a religiously dedicated and incredibly talented enemy. They could not destroy the nomadic armies of the Arabs. The Sassanids were conquered nearly wholesale, and the Byzantines surrendered to their new heartland of Anatolia. And that was the end of the famous Roman and Persian rivalry, which lasted nearly 700 years, in which one could never conquer the other. The reasons we have discussed, which you can see on the screen, reverberated for 7 centuries. Changing circumstances were not enough to tip the balance in one or the other's favour for total victory. And that is why the Romans and Persians could never conquer each other. But before we finish, it would also be worth mentioning why similar conquests were instead successful. Firstly, the Achaemenid Persians were able to invade the western portions of the Middle East, but there was no unified empire of the West to resist them. Secondly, Alexander the Great and his Macedonian Greek army was able to annex the entire Persian Empire, but the Persians were weakened compared to their peak under Cyrus or Darius, having only reconquered Egypt recently, for example. After Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Anatolia, they did not have established borders to defend from. He was a new enemy to face. The Macedonian army formation of the phalanx was also very difficult to counter. But perhaps most importantly, Alexander was one of the greatest military generals in history, never losing a battle. This helped ensure his conquests would be uniquely successful. As for our final example, the Ottomans were able to maintain control of Mesopotamia for centuries, despite opposition from numerous Persian dynasties. This is because Persia did not hold relatively equal footing to the Ottomans regarding military strength, as the Romans did with the Persians. Sophisticated administrative systems existed by this point for the Ottomans to utilize, so holding on to Mesopotamia was easier than it was for the Romans. With those important counterexamples out of the way, we'll be leaving it there for this video. This has been History's Influence. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Catch you later.